Poker's legendary champions, next-generation stars, and tireless ambassadors of the game, sharing their wisdom and guiding your journey to high achievement on the green felt. This is Chasing Poker Greatness with your host, Brad Wilson.
Welcome, my friend, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com, Coach Brad Wilson. And on today's show, I have the honor of welcoming back the always uplifting, inquisitive, and maybe the most insanely positive human being I've stumbled across in my journey through life, Sky Matsuhashi. Sky's the creator and founder of the massively popular Smart Poker Study podcast, as well as the poker training platform, thepokerforge.com. He's also the author of 4 books, including How to Study Poker Volumes 1 and 2, Preflop Online Poker, and Postflop Online Poker. Here's a behind-the-scenes story as to the standard of performance in which Sky holds himself. There's actually a lost episode in between Sky's first appearance on CPG, episode 19, and the show you're about to listen to today. In that lost episode, which in my personal opinion was a very valuable high-level conversation, Sky felt like he left some greatness bombs on the table and requested we give it another go. And as someone who never turns down an opportunity to have amazing conversation with folks I love and respect, we did just that. And Sky did not disappoint. Here are some greatness bombs you're about to hear in today's conversation with Sky Matsuhashi. How to study poker with a purpose so that you improve your skills and avoid information overload. How to effectively combat those no fold'em hold'em limpers you battle against on the green felt. Why knowing what you should do is a different beast than actually doing what you're supposed to do. And much, much more. And now, without any further ado, I present to you 4-time author, poker coach, and prolific podcaster, the one and only Sky Matsuhashi. Mr. Matsuhashi, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great, Brad, and you?
I'm doing very, very well. It's nice seeing your face. Always a pleasant person to talk to, uplifting, positive. I always leave conversations with you in a better place than where I started.
Nice. I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you so very much. And I remember the last time we talked way back in December of 2019, pre-COVID times, time just flies, man. It's hard to believe that like 2020, it was such a weird year. I can't really even place. I had to go back and look up our prior episodes. You had me on your podcast episode 19. I had you on my podcast episode 264. And I had no idea when it happened. I had to go back and actually physically look up the different dates. But yeah, back in 2019, what a crazy year and a half or so it's been since we last talked.
Yeah, I live and die by the quote that the days are long, but the years are short. And it feels like just yesterday that you came on the podcast the first time. It's been a year and a half. Quite frankly, it feels incredible that CPG has existed for a year and a half at this point. And sometimes I like buy domain names, right? It's like a thing that I do. And I'll get reminders. I got a reminder of a domain name that I bought a year ago for a project that never materialized. And it feels like it was just yesterday. Like the time just freaking flies by. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So that domain name, I don't give it to me. You don't want to spoil things and put that out there probably, but did you have like was it like a crazy course idea or like a membership site that you wanted to do?
No, it was like a social poker app that basically the premise of it, I don't mind just saying it out there in the world if anybody ever wanted to do it, but basically it was a play money way that did a more efficient job than current play money sites of tracking everybody's results. So settling up at the end of the night and all of that. Just a way to play private tables against your friends and then settle up afterwards.
Yeah.
The person that actually did it very, very well and much smarter business model than me was Tom Wheaton, who made the Faded Spade private poker rooms, which, is pretty much what I was
aiming to do. But then he branded it as like charity and basically sold access to the rooms themselves to brand and raise money for charity. So it was more B2B than, B2C, which worked out very, very well for Tom. I'm actually happy that things fell through for me because it gave me bandwidth and space to make the stuff that I'm actually passionate about, my courses that I've been releasing over time. So yeah, anyway, not everything is a success. Not every idea comes to fruition. And that's just, I think, the way that reality works. You just gotta keep trying, and eventually some things will work out.
For sure. I agree with that. And I believe the old adage, ideas are a dime a dozen. There's so many ideas. I have ideas all the time. I've had ideas for like 17 different kinds of books I can write, but they just didn't pan out. Like an idea, great. That's an initial spark. But if it doesn't develop like a sense of, I have to do that, it just kind of goes by the wayside. And I have a big long list of all different ideas I've typed out in Microsoft Word over the years, but most of them will never come to fruition. They sounded really good at the time when I came up with that 2-sentence description of that idea, but I'm not going to follow through.
Yeah, I mean, and that's just, the execution. I was having a conversation with my family, and they don't always have a ton of business experience. And like my kids were really big into Shopkins, and I don't know if anybody has kids or knows what a Shopkin is or was. I don't even know if they exist anymore, but they were these little collector, silly little household things that were like micro-sized. And, my family's like, what an amazing idea. Would have been, it's so easy. We could have done that. And I'm just like, so how do you manage production? How do you manage distribution? How do you manage creating contacts to get it in retail stores? How do you raise money for that first wave? How do you pay for marketing to all of these kids? Like, it seems like a simple idea, yet it is certainly not a simple thing to execute the idea, right? So like, simple does not always mean easy.
No, definitely not. And I bet 1 million people had the idea for Uber before Uber came along and actually built the website, built the app, built the infrastructure to do that, but so they spent probably millions of dollars, thousands of man hours before it even hit the market, right? And your average person who says, I can create an app to let people drive each other around. It sounds so easy and simple until you actually start doing the work, doing the legwork necessary to figure that stuff out.
Yeah, I mean, everything's just way more complex. Every project I've ever started, I started a project eventually called Nuffle, which was neutralize flop leads, and basically mass data powered strategy on how to play perfectly when somebody donks into you on the flop, right? And I thought, this is a thing that I can figure out in like a day. I felt like it was a day I could figure it out, right? Because I always underestimate how in-depth things go. And then I realized like, okay, so you face a flop donk. Now we have a decision here. And then that decision is going to create more complexity down the decision tree. So if you raise, then what boards do you continue bluffing on? What boards do you stop bluffing on? What sizing is the optimal bluff size? What do you do with your value? Like if you call the flop and then they barrel the turn, like do we get to bluff raise? And if we do get to bluff raise, what rivers should we bluff as well? And you can see that like things just, what started out as a simple thing spiraled in downward into complexity of like, wow, this game tree actually gets really, really big when we're taking into consideration 5 different sizes villain can use, 5 different raise sizes that we can use, and then figuring out like which strategy outperforms all the other strategies.
Yeah, without a doubt. And then now that after you accumulate all that data and everything, now it's your job as the coach to distill it down to the simplest things that they could take away from watching your videos or reading your text. I don't know how you presented Nuffle as a course or anything, but it's up to you now to teach all that stuff that you spent days or however long it was.
Weeks. It was weeks.
Weeks figuring out all that info, So your challenge didn't stop when you collected the data. A new challenge began at that point, right? And then once you create that course and you have it all set, a new challenge of now marketing it, like you had mentioned earlier with those little toys, right? Like there's so many things that initially you have this idea, this will be a great course, people will learn from it, but then the spokes just branch out from there as you keep going. And it's pretty interesting. And even though you and I have created lots of different products, it's still like every time we don't foresee what we're going to have to do as the next step.
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head there about reducing the complexity of the data, making it visually appealing, learnable, executable, right? And I think Nuffle's the first course that when I saw the outcome, the end product, I was like, holy shit, this is awesome. It was the first, I allowed myself to give me congratulations.
Sweet.
Like, this is a one PDF thing. You just open it. It's one PDF.
It's one PDF?
It's very intuitive, very easy to learn, very easy to execute. And yeah, it takes all that data work and data analysis that I did into consideration, which to me, I'm extremely proud of, like the simplicity that I, distilled it down to at the end of the day. Yeah. But yeah, and then here's another thing that happens too that people don't often consider. If my process for data analysis improves and I'm able to improve my precision, well, that has an effect on everything that I've ever made. And so then I need to go back and reanalyze past strategies to update them to make them current, which basically means that I'm changing I'm regularly updating my past courses with new knowledge and information. My poor virtual assistant is like perpetually watermarking hundreds and hundreds of PDFs to send out to my customers. But I mean, that's the reality of it. Like, even once you have a thing that is done, like Preflop Bootcamp is great and it's awesome, and people are growing, learning, making money. It's really changing how my customers experience poker for the better. And yet I still look at that product and I think, how can I make this better? Like, this is based on optimal solves, right? The next step would be to design Preflop Bootcamp, redesign it, update it with preflop information that's based on mass data and big data and strategies that perform better against different player profiles. And I know that, like, that's the next step. It is just a Herculean task, but again, that's the nature of it. Like, as you learn and grow, like, strategies evolve. And I think that mass data analysis is at the bleeding edge as it relates to poker strategies. And so my process will just improve as I get better at it, which basically just means that every time I get better at it, there's lots of downstream work and stuff that I need to upgrade and improve.
For sure. That's the way it is. I do the same thing with my membership, thepokerforge.com. But also, as soon as you mentioned, create this new thing and you have to change these other things, I automatically thought of a few different podcasts, poker podcasts that I released, like whatever number it was, number 50, number 12, number 112. I'm on episode 340 something right now. So when I learn something new, sometimes I realize, wait a second, I said something different, or I had a different thought process when I did this podcast on it in the past. So what I've done just within the podcast realm is I'll delete that old podcast and even delete the page it was on, go to Libsyn and delete it from the directory so nobody can find it anymore. And then I'll create a new podcast with my recent learnings or whatever new strategy conclusions I've come up with. And I've done that quite a few times. And the great thing about that is, bam, I have an episode idea that I could do this week right now. Just make some changes to this old podcast and release it again. It saves a little bit of time on my podcast creation weekly,
Yeah, for sure. And that's a great way of serving your audience and making sure that they're always getting the right information. I would say that personally, I'm relieved when someone changes their strategy. When a high level player says, "Oh, I need to correct this. I need to amend this because the way that I thought about it before was not right." Because that means they're actively growing, right? They're actively growing. They're testing the strategies. They're steel manning them, which is the way that it ought to be. Any strategy that I ever create, I want my people to poke it, prod it, try to break it, try to find the flaws, because ultimately that creates a stronger product. And this is a thing that happened, maybe a few months back. John, my Tactical Tuesday co-host, we were going through some strategies that I developed using mass data as it relates to defending against turn raises. And he told me, Brad, doesn't this kind of contradict what you said 4 months back, like during private coaching sessions, about how, the nature of a fish is to be passive. And when they go against their nature, like we really need to take that into consideration and tighten up to call down, etc. And I said, yeah, of course. Like, this does go contrary to what I said before, because I'm learning, right? Because I'm growing, because like now I see the data, which is like a 30,000 foot view of what's actually happening and what they're actually doing, instead of just like anecdotal experiences of like, oh, a fish raised me one time and they had this hand. Now it's like, no, by looking at 50 million hands and all of these iterations of what fish are raising with, you get a great idea of exactly what they're doing, which is going to affect strategy. And like, if you're so hell bent on being right versus just doing the best thing that you can possibly do, then you won't change, you won't grow. And ultimately, I think that leads to your demise as a poker player.
Yeah, for sure it does. And I love how you've mentioned quite a few times the word fish, tackling fish, thinking about fish. I always think about fish. Like, who is my target at the table? I look for the 2 or 3. Maybe even if I go lucky, all 5 players I'm up against are fish at the table, right? Depending on the site you play on, everything. And I'm just all about tackling the fish, right? I understand trying to employ strategies like for your entire range and trying to balance your different strategies. That's all good. It is good to have balance and stuff. But when I'm in this hand right now against this fish, I understand his tendencies. My goal, as much as possible, is to exploit his tendencies. Maybe he's calling every flop, but folding every turn. Awesome. I'm going to double barrel every single time against this guy, double barrel bluff him, right? If I have a super strong value hand, I'll C bet on the flop, let him call on the turn. Maybe I'll check behind because he folds so often. I don't want this fish to leave, right? So I love how you mentioned, and I know you have a course called Fish in a Barrel. And I was thinking about fish earlier today because I just started playing on Ignition Poker. And that site, for any listeners right now who aren't on Ignition, if you're just sticking with the main sites, the Poker Stars, the ACR or something, you've got to play Ignition. It's just full of fish, and it's my new it's my new love of poker, right? It's spurring me to play more than I ever have, not ever have, but more than I have up to now this current year.
Yeah, Ignition is good times. And I think the great news about Ignition too is you gain clarity on like what everybody's doing, just because you can download the hands 48 hours afterwards and you get to see everybody's hole cards, which can be very insightful as it relates to like, what are people folding to my big river bets? And, you know, did this person bluff me in this spot? If I make a big fold, that you get to get validated, or you get a reminder that you got to call lots of rivers. And, you know, the reason that I landed on fish specifically was because imagine you're playing 6-handed, right? And, you know, the regs all have an edge against you, right? Say a 1 big blind per 100 edge or something like that, right? So basically 4 other regs are at the table, then there's you. And so you're losing, you know, minus 4 BBs per 100 playing against these guys. And then a fish sits down and the fish is losing 20 BBs per 100, right? Now, if everybody gets an equal share, all 5 of you, then that takes you from losing 4 big blinds to breaking even, right? So that one fish means that you're now breaking even. Fish is losing 20. All the regs are now winning like 5 BBs per 100, assuming that everybody gets an equal share of the fish's loss rate, right? So everything that I make is to make sure you get more than your fair share of the fish's loss rate, which dramatically impacts your bottom line, because that's where most of your winning comes from. Most of your winning is not going to come from battling the other regs. And quite frankly, the more that I dive into it, it's actually turned into this little thing where I just want to solve how to optimally beat the fish so that I can then focus on the regs in the pool and construct strong strategies against them. And then basically at that point, then the game of poker is just fun times all around, when you have a strategy in place that you just know you can execute and you know what it is and it's automatic. And then you get to focus and free up bandwidth to battling the regs in your pool, which, I mean, I love the money that I make from the fish, but it is fun battling regs and getting into intricate spots and like the challenge aspect of that. I do enjoy that. I mean, I'm not going to, you know, I'm the type of poker player that will fire up the 1K&L at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and just battle with 2 or 3 regs until, you know, waiting for somebody to sit at the table. I don't really mind. I accept that challenge. I think it's fun. But ultimately, like, if we're being honest with ourselves, the money comes from when the weaker players sit down at the table. That's where the win rate is derived from. And so it's the only intelligent way I could imagine tackling poker, is to focus on the people that you win the most money from first, and then focus on the stronger players secondly.
100%. Yeah. One of my big goals is when I sit down at a table, the first thing is I try to find who the fish are. And then I try to figure out ways that I can isolate them to myself, whether they're in the blinds. So I'm going to raise, 3.5 big blinds, whatever gets the regs to fold, and the fishy player out of the blinds just a call. They limp and I ISO raise, they raise, I 3-bet. I do what I can to get those fish heads up, because that's how, sure, you have the strategy against the weakest players, but you're only going to get to use your strategy if you get into hands with them, So for me, that's always my first step at the table. Find the fish, figure out how to isolate them, and then, of course, employ those post-flop strategies that you're talking about. And occasionally, you can't help it. Those regs fight back, or you're just dealt the right hand at the right time, and you go up against the regs. But those aren't situations to shy away from. Not that, obviously, you tackle those situations, right? You don't shy away from them. But that's where growth comes from, tackling those strongest players, the other strong players at the table. And that reminds me of, there was a Netflix movie, or maybe an Amazon Prime movie recently, called Blade of the Immortal. Did you watch it?
I don't think so. No, I haven't ever heard of it.
Yeah, it's based on a Japanese comic book, but it's a Japanese movie. And a samurai warrior, he's actually a Ronin,
a masterless warrior.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you very much.
I don't know why or how I know
that. Yeah. He is one of the best swordsmen ever. He kills 100 dudes. This is the beginning of the movie, so I'm not spoiling too much. Kills 100 dudes, but then he all of a sudden becomes immortal. And because he's immortal, he kind of over time stops caring about using his skills. And so he's just going in there willy-nilly hacking people and stuff, as opposed to he used to be a master swordsman. And that's how we continually sharpen our saws. Not only are we studying off the felt and trying to work on trouble spots and everything, but we pit ourselves against those other players that we think are strong and figure out ways to exploit their tendencies and avoid their exploits against us as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Alex Honnold free soloing, the movie Free Solo, where he free solos El Capitan, and he talks about how when he's free soloing a climb, how he's so close to death that any false move will cost him his life. And that's the reality of the spots he puts himself in. But it doesn't mean that he doesn't care about living, because he practices like a maniac. He prepares like an insane person, of marking every single step of the way, does, hundreds of climbs, with harnesses and safety belts and everything, to basically map out his exact strategy for when he does free solo something. But at the end of the day, he's very close to death. And because of that, when he's free soloing, he feels the most alive, and he has to be present. He has to be in the moment. And I feel like that's kind of how it is when you're playing against some of the strongest players in the world. You have to notice everything. You can't miss any data points. You've got to prioritize the right thing. And if you're not seeing all the things, they will make you pay. Not in such an extreme version of Alex Honnold with your life, but you will lose a stack. They will crush you and take your money. And so when you're facing a high level of competition, like you said, with risk, you're just naturally going to perform at the best of your abilities, because you need to.
Yeah, 100%. Anytime I catch myself playing robotically, daydreaming and dozing, that seems like the spots where I just get myself into trouble, right? Just playing robotically, button clicking, calling, 3-betting, whatever I'm doing. But all of a sudden it's a turn. I get to the turn and I have second pair and it's a 50 big blind pot. I think, how did I get here? What is going on? I don't even know who my opponent is. And I just suddenly wake up to the fact, like I become present out of nowhere, right? Uh-huh. And I realize, holy cow, terrible spot to be in. Of course, you want to do your best at that moment to get yourself out of it, to win the pot, to extricate yourself without losing too much money, whatever the case may be. But those little spots of realization that you weren't focused, that you were playing robotically, that you weren't paying attention to all the information there, those are spots that should wake you up and have you like think back and realize, what was going on? Was I looking at my phone or on Twitter, or was it Facebook, or was I doing an email? Was I listening to music and I started singing along and not paying attention? I mean, when you find those spots where you're not focused, you're not in the zone, try to look back and analyze those and figure out what you did wrong so that you can work to not repeat that next time.
I can tell you what I do wrong. I came out into this world with ADHD. And so distractions are very much a part of my life. I can't tell you, it happened to me an embarrassing amount probably 12, 13 years ago, where I'd be playing, 6 tables at a time, sometimes like 8 or so. But I would just sort of lose focus for a moment, daydream, and look at my screen. And, I'm just playing like a $600 pot with an ace and a deuce, and I have no pair, no draw. And I'm just like, not just how do I win the pot, but like, how did I get here? Like, how did this happen? Which is, and that's just losing focus for a moment, taking your eyes off the ball, and then you zone back in and you're like, holy shit, I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking to get me here. And I sure as hell don't know the best path moving forward, because I have no idea how I got here in the first place.
You can even think back to the pre-flop action. Was I the 3-bet or the caller? Did I squeeze somebody? What happened?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Those are the spots where I use Poker Tracker 4. I know you're a Hold'em Manager guy. I love Poker Tracker 4, but those are the spots when I wake up and realize, holy cow, I'm in an uncomfortable spot. I don't know what I'm doing. I automatically tag it with a review tag. And then the next time I'm studying, I'm always pulling up any hands I've tagged for review. And I actually have come to realize that when I'm doing a study session any given day, if I do not have any tagged hands from the prior few sessions I played, there's a pretty good chance I wasn't as focused as I should be, right? Because if I'm always thinking about the situations, thinking about my opponents, there's always got to be some kind of question, some kind of nuance that I think I might be missing out on. I should constantly be tagging hands. And like, for example, if I'm playing with a focus of, like you had said, in Knuffles, facing those flop donk bets, right? I should be really trying to focus and watch the action for every hand, whether I'm involved or not. If somebody donk bets into another player, I've got to put myself in that player's shoes and say, wait a second, he just faced this donk bet. What does that donk bet mean? If I were him, if I had top pair, what would I do? Second pair. If I had ace high, what would I do right there, right? So, and then if I don't know what I would do, that would be a perfect hand. Even though I'm not involved, tag it. Force myself to think about it later on, develop some strategies. And the whole goal with that tagging and reviewing hands is so next time you're a little bit stronger, that next time you face that exact same situation. And facing donk bets, that happens a lot on Ignition and most other poker sites as well.
Fish donk about 20% of the time, 18 to 20% of the time, which is actually a really high number as it relates to just that strategy, because I know that regs do not donk anywhere near that. It's around like 2 to 3%, I think it's like 90 to 95% of all flop donks are done by fish.
I would believe it
in general. And what's interesting about stuff like Knuffle is like, you don't have to tag or even think because the data just tells you exactly what you ought to do. You just actually, it seems like too simple, but even with the answer, the right answer on what you're supposed to do, I still see people screw it up. Regularly.
Sure.
It's like you got the cheat sheet, you got the answer in front of you, and we're not executing it. Why? Like, what's happening here? And like a lot of the times, it's just I think that people feel uncomfortable for whatever reason. Who knows? They just got stacked twice at their other tables. Their confidence is low. They just want to avoid a spot. Maybe they're trying to lock up a win. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but this is another thing that I've learned through the stuff that I create using mass data, where it's like, here, this is it. This is like your gold right here. Just execute, right? That's your job. Just execute the strategies as they're constructed. Even that's easier said than done for some folks. And I think that kind of, I think it ties into emotions. Like I mentioned before, they're biased for some reason. They feel like this spot is the exception to the rule. But I think, again, that's sort of our humanity just kind of playing tricks on us because, we're just incredibly prone to biases and incredibly prone to believing that, like, same guy 3-bets you 3 times in a row. They've got some sort of vendetta against you and they're just targeting you specifically. And like, they know that they know, and they're playing like 4D chess, when the reality is they most likely just got 3 hands that ought to be 3-bet 3 times in a row against you.
Most likely,
constructing some narrative in your mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of what you were saying about not wanting to pull the trigger on those plays that you should, and maybe they're trying to book a win or they just lost 2 buy-ins, like you had said. A big thing I tell my students is just do it scared. I tell you what the right strategies are. You want a 3-bet bluff with this hand against this type of player, raise a donk bet, call the river bet, whatever the strategy is, as long as you've reasoned through what your opponent's range is and how it probably interacts with this board, and you think you understand what their bet is trying to accomplish, do it scared, right? If the donk bet is an obvious bluff, or let's say it's a blocking bet with a flush draw, and then it's a blocking bet with a flush draw, that raising is the best play because they're making a bluff bet right now. Raising is the best play. Just do it scared. And I don't mean scared like you're freaked out scared, but there's something committing chips when you see monsters under the bed, or you think this is the one hand, the exception to the rule. Just do it scared anyway. And eventually that scared feeling will start to dissipate and it'll be gone entirely. And the goal with, I'm sure, Nuffle and all of my stuff that I teach, all my courses and everything, the goal is to get you comfortable with whatever the strategy topic within the video is, right? But the only way you're going to get comfortable is if you continually practice it. You look for spots to practice it. So employing the strategies, especially when you have a one-sheet PDF giving you all the answers, you have no reason to not do it. Just do it scared.
Right. And I think it does boil down a little bit to trust, right? Trust in the strategy as it's constructed, trust in the data analysis and what the data is saying, and then trusting that more than your human biases, like you leveraging that trust, counting on it, like you said, doing it scared. The funny thing is, like, as it relates to Nuffle and all the stuff that I make, I could prove and show you how much money it's worth for you to execute the strategies. I could break it down and say, this wins you +3 big blinds every single time you do it. So if you fold, you're just throwing away 3 big blinds, right? And even that, I think, it's hard. I think when people are afraid, when they're scared, when they're biased, when they think that this situation is different for reason X, Y, or Z, they just become much more hesitant to pull the trigger. And unsurprisingly, the folks who are the most successful through all the stuff that I make through private coaching are the ones that trust me implicitly, and they just execute, and they don't really ask many questions. They're like, okay, like, Coach Brad is putting me in a position to be successful. I believe in him. I believe he wants me to be successful, and all the incentives align, right? Like, if I start creating courses that start torching people's bankrolls and people are losing money hand over fist, well, I'm not going to have a business very long, right? Yep. So, like, I'm incentivized to provide that value, to provide things that are going to make you money. And then it just boils down to, like, just trust and execute. And that's actually caution people. I tell them not to buy my stuff if they're the type of person that's not going to trust me, because ultimately what it leads to is them making me miserable by asking questions over and over and over again that are very obvious and that I've already proven and that I've shown them. And, they also don't get the value out of the course because they're not executing the strategies. So yeah, if you're not willing to put your trust in the stuff that I personally make, don't buy it. That's fine. I'm totally cool with that, because I want to work with the folks that trust and believe and progress and grow and then become a customer for life, because they just know that, like, the stuff that I sell is worth gold.
Absolutely. 100%. So, when you play on Ignition, do you use a HUD?
I do.
Mm-hmm. Cool. What are because it's anonymous tables, right? You have, you start with 0 from any new player. Because I started playing on Ignition recently, I had to build a new HUD for it. Because I just wanted to take off the HUD stats that don't accumulate really quickly. Any turn and river stats I removed from the HUD, right? Because most of it's pre-flop and flop stuff, and I'm really finding so much value in 4 different stats: VPIP, PFR, 3-bet, maybe not 3-bet, but more AF would be a better one. Because a lot of people on Ignition, at least at the stakes I play, 10 NL and 25 NL, there's not a lot of 3-betters, right? There's a ton of limpers, a ton of callers, and open raisers, but not a lot of 3-betters, So I think VPIP, PFR, and AF, I really enjoy those HUD stats. Which ones do you really find yourself paying attention to when you play?
Well, I have to state a disclaimer here, because firstly, I think HUD is, especially on a site like Ignition, but even in general, I think it's a little over-relied on to determine your action, especially like when most of my strategies are based on data. So, like, that's like, I already know, like once I create a player profile in my mind and I label that player that profile, I kind of already know what the HUD is going to look like ultimately and have strategies constructed against them specifically. So like I use VPIP, PFR, 3-bet, folded 3-bet, and C-bet and folded C-bet. And I think those are really the only stats that I pay any attention to. And even the C-bet and folded C-bet stats, I don't really look at that often. And even the folded 3-bet stat, I think like nowadays regs pretty much play pre-flop pretty well just in general. So I already have an expectation as to like how they're going to play. It is valuable, I guess, if you get like a fish that folds to 3-bets all the time and then another fish that calls all 3-bets, like your strategies are going to be very different facing those two different fishy profiles. But by and large, I use the HUD as kind of like my fish radar. And that's really the major use case of the HUD on Ignition for me.
Yeah, 100%. You want to find those fish, and like just a big gap between VPIP and PFR. That's a critical thing. Small AF too, for me, aggression factor. Small AF means they just don't like to bet a lot post flop. They're doing a lot of calling and checking, which is great. Easier fish to target right there. Those two things are awesome. But then also, I love what you said about fold to C-bet and C-bet. I understand how they aren't the most important stats, because once you have your range and you understand who you're up against, you have a pretty good idea whether or not to bluff on most different flop textures and everything like that. But I still do use them just because it is useful seeing if somebody has faced 7 C-bets in 60 hands and they folded 6 out of the 7, there's a pretty good chance they're going to be folding again, right? So you're right. You do have your set kind of strategies that you develop by playing for a long time, understanding your opponent's ranges and seeing that board texture. But those HUD stats always help me quite a bit, make some good reads on my opponents. And I like what you said also about the fold to 3-bet, really classifying, I guess, breaking down the different types of fish and how they will likely respond. And if they're going to be folding a ton to 3-bets, 3-bet them plenty, right? Get the fish heads up to yourself, but they open raise a 2.5 big blinds. That's an easy 4 big blind pot, 2.5 plus the 1.5 in the blinds for a simple 3-bet. And you know, everybody's folding right there. So yeah, I still use those HUD stats. And I've had a lot of people contact me over the years and say, Sky, HUD stats aren't useful before you get 100 or 200 hands. And that's not really the case at all, right? Like you can start to get a decent read on somebody in the first 3 orbits, 18 hands, right? If they VPIP 40%, wow, that's a pretty darn fishy player just in the first 18 hands right there. So I still do use the HUD, and I recommend to everybody, even if you think it's a crutch, it's at least additional information that if you're 4-tabling, you're not really paying attention to this guy in seat 2 all the time because maybe you're dealt these other hands over here, but your HUD is paying attention. So finally you get involved in a hand with him and you realize, whoa, this is a fish. And you take it from there. So I do use that HUD for just additional helpful info.
And I think that somebody that says, HUD's not useful until you have 200 hands, or it's just, whatever, like they have reservations about playing on a site where you can't really use a HUD to its maximal ability. I would just say, like, stop being so reliant on your HUD and stop letting the HUD dictate what your decisions ought to be, because you're a thinking human being, and like any aggregated data like that coming from somebody that analyzes tons of data all the time, like even if you have 100,000 hands on me that date back the last 2 years, I promise you the HUD stats are not indicative of the strategy that I deploy today. Definitely, because I'm currently growing, learning, evolving. And so if you take those aggregate stats and you try to use them to construct counter strategies, they're not going to be as successful because I'm changing all the time, right? It kind of goes back to my thoughts on win rate. And if you know your win rate with any degree of certainty, you're doing something wrong. You're making some kind of mistake, right? Because like, as they say, you need 300,000 hands to determine your true win rate and figure out where your true win rate is. And I would just challenge you to say, if you're the same player on hand 1 as you are hand 300,000, you fucked up. Like you've messed up, right? You're not playing poker correctly, right? So like you should really never know what your true win rate is, because you're always growing, evolving, changing, and you just make peace with that and just make peace with, like, I'm going to be the best I can. And my assumption is if I'm always working towards that, my win rate is going to be the biggest that it can possibly be. And, you just make peace and say, like, okay, well, I'm just going to put in hands, put in volume, and trust that I know what I'm doing. And at the end of the day, I'm going to be a profitable winning poker player.
Yeah, 100%. I view win rate the exact same way, but I really like looking at win rates for very specific situations. 2-bet, then call 3-bet, calling the flop C-bet, calling the river bet. And when you see a highly negative win rate in any given area over a large sample, right? Like calling that river bet, if your win rate is like negative 2,000 over like 700 hands, 700 instances of calling 2-bets, then you definitely have an issue there that you need to work and address. So those negative win rates in specific spots, those help me target my own areas of my skills that I want to improve, but also it helps me help my students know where they need to work as well.
Yeah, and that's just the value in like database reviews and really like this poker strategy and just the poker players. I was speaking about this with the private coaching student that I have just today, and think about how I think about poker and how to go about like the making upgrades and the improvement process. I look at poker as a car, and for those who are mechanically inclined in the audience right now, forgive my metaphor because I do not know anything about car restoration or even cars in general, but that's the metaphor that I'm going to be using. Basically, car has multiple components, right? Like if your tire is flat, you don't take out the engine to fix the engine. You fix the tire. So you focus on the specific component of the car, make the upgrades necessary by isolating said component, and then put it back in the car. And that's how I look at poker learning, poker growth, poker courses. I look at them as like, pre-flop boot camp. We're taking your pre-flop strategy out of the car. We're looking at it. We're analyzing it. We're immersing ourselves into pre-flop. And then we're putting it back into your system so that your car can run much better and perform at a higher level. And just taking out, with Nuffle, okay, this is your dealing with flop donk bet strategy right here. We're going to upgrade it through Nuffle. We're going to put it back in your system. And then just over time, you're upgrading these parts of your system until you're operating at a very, very high level. And I think that just serves people much better than trying to upgrade the whole car at the same time, because you get a lot of like scatter shot approaches. There are multiple components to this game. It's just infinitely complex. And it's kind of like trying to make a dent in the ocean levels by just drinking the water, right? Like you just can't do it. It's just it's too much. It's too massive of a problem to tackle. And that's why people feel overwhelmed. And that's why like really the number one pain point that people come to me with is like undirected study. I don't know what to study. I don't know what to focus my energy on, because like there are 100 things you could focus your energy on that are all going to be impactful. So like, where do you start? It's I guess it's like the old what's the word? Basically, like how do you eat an elephant, right? Mm-hmm. One bite at a time.
One bite at a time. Yeah,
that's how you go about becoming a winning, good, solid poker player as well.
Yeah, 100%. And big thing, of course, and I love how your pre-flop boot camp, I mean, that's working on your foundation, right? That's working on like the engine of your car, I guess, because you cannot run without an engine, or you're going to run really crappy and it's going to take you 17 days to get from here to Vegas or something, right? So that makes a lot of sense. I love that. I love that approach. I love that metaphor, working on your car. One thing I've never thought of a metaphor for it. So I'll be using that with my students from now on. Thanks, Brad.
You're very welcome.
Yep.
I also think of it as like mini games, how poker is one giant game, and then there are games within the game, and just isolating those mini games, getting really good at them, putting them back in, and then naturally you perform at a higher level, right? Like, and everything. Pre-flop bootcamp I created because I was so tired of seeing people in Greatness Village using bad pre-flop strategies that it was like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to answer any more questions about like when you're in the big blind, the button opens and you 3-bet queen jack off out of the big blind. Like that's the end of the hand. You messed up. You don't 3-bet that. You just flat it. Like, what are we doing here? Yeah. So it's really necessity for my own sanity was why I made pre-flop bootcamp. And it's not sexy, right? It's not sexy. It's not fun to teach, but like you said, it's foundational. Every hand starts pre-flop, and every pre-flop decision you make snowballs into flop turn river. Like you start out playing too many hands, well, you're going to have to overfold post flop because you started with too many hands pre-flop. And I think too, like there's not a high level of awareness as to how pre-flop affects your overall win rate and your strategy. And that's because you don't often get direct feedback on how well you're playing pre-flop, because the hand doesn't just end. You make it to the river and then the hand ends. So like, I just think people very much overestimate their ability to play well pre-flop and don't understand that that's like a root cause to many of the symptoms of like paying off too much on the river, overfolding on the turn, whatever it might be. You know, that's just a symptom. The real problem is that you messed up pre-flop, and you need to go back there, invest time and energy, fix that first and foremost.
100%. That's one thing I always do with my students. That's how the Poker Forge, my membership site, starts off too. We work on your pre-flop game first because it's amazing. Like students come to me, they've had all these issues for years, calling C-bets, C-betting and facing raises. I don't know what to do in these different post-flop spots. But once we drill down and first fix and give them a solid pre-flop foundation, a lot of those pain points post-flop just go away. Not fully away, because maybe they still don't understand what to do in that exact situation. But if they take themselves out of like a 3-bet pot with queen jack offsuit from out of position, like you had said, if you're not in that spot anymore, but instead you just called, kept the pot smaller, sure, you're out of position, but you didn't bloat the pot. Now you don't have that initiative to c-bet, to be forced to feel that you need to c-bet. You feel you need a double barrel. But when you're out of position, now you have some options. Check call, check fold, check raise, depending on what you think they're doing with their initial raising range. Because when you 3-bet with queen jack and they end up calling you, they crush your queen jack. They've got at worst ace queen, ace jack, which crushes your queen jack, right? They've got jacks and queens and maybe tens, decent pocket pairs, right? But if you just call them with that queen jack, yeah, they still have all their suited and offsuit aces, their jack 10 suited, their pocket fours, their 6-7 suited, their queen 10, their queen 9, all the stuff that your queen jack plays pretty well against, right?
Jack 5 suited.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is the bottom, all that kind of, the bottom opening range of the button.
Yeah. All that kind of stuff, right? So you've kept their range wide. Now you have a pre-flop, not thinking about your whole range, but just that queen jack, you have a decent equity advantage, or maybe not exactly an advantage, but you're not at a super disadvantage in a bigger 3-bet pot against a tighter range. And that's just going to help you play better, get into better spots post-flop as well.
And there's also downstream considerations too, right? Of like, if you 3-bet your offsuit Broadway hands, you have 12 combos of offsuit hands compared to 4 combos of suited, right? So you start 3-betting your queen jack off, your king jack off, your king queen off at 100% frequency, your ace jack off. Now all of a sudden, I think that was 4 combos that I just mentioned there. That's 48 offsuit combos you've added to your 3-betting range. So now when you see a flop of 9-6 deuce, well, if you're over 3-betting, now you're going to have many more combos of those offsuit hands, which makes your range weaker, which means villains can play very well against your now weakened range because you chunked all those hands into your 3-betting strategy, which means you get floated more often. Villains just have a higher degree of confidence in calling your C-bets with, like on 9-6 deuce, pocket sevens is like a slam dunk call. And then if you're prone to double barreling, they just get to call you down, because now instead of just having like ace king off and ace queen off in your 3-betting range, you've got all of these offsuit Broadway. So you're over 3-betting, which means you're over bluffing post flop, which means villains get to call you down lighter, which means that like you're often in these out of position scenarios against clever thinking opponents who are observant, and they're just going to eat your lunch. I mean, they're just going to eat you alive. Like, if I'm raising the button there and a player is over 3-betting, I'm so pumped. I'm so happy because like now I just get to call, realize my positional advantage, and then make great decisions against a range that I know, is comprised of a lot of hands that routinely have air and are going to struggle to perform out of position.
Yep. That's exactly right. And so you get the chance now. Well, so when you make those 3-bets that you shouldn't with those offsuit hands, like you had mentioned, you're giving your opponents that great opportunity that you strive for against those loose, aggressive over three betters, right? Like you want to be that player, like you had just mentioned. You love it when you're up against an over three better in the big blind because now you get all these options. You can bet when they check, you can raise them when they bet half pot, quarter pot, whatever it is. Like you're reading them for exactly what they have, a crap hand on a hard to hit board in a bloated pot. You can make a decent sized bet and just really scare them off the hand pretty easily. Or if you flop something good, just let them double barrel, triple barrel into you and just call them down. Let them spew all their chips at you.
And it's all about frequency, right? Like maybe they're not ultra aggressive post flop. Maybe they check a lot and they don't see bet a lot. Well, that just means that they're not going to protect their checking range. And so when they check, they're going to be check folding very often.
Yep,
so like
exactly.
even if you're not over aggressing, you could be under aggressing, right? Like it's very, very hard to play a strong, well-balanced strategy when you're just making these kind of fundamental mistakes and you have too many lower equity type hands in your pre-flop range. So like that's sort of what I mean by pre-flop just sets everything up post-flop, and it creates issues that like most humans never even see, understand, or realize. But like, yeah, and I'll give this little tidbit out there to the listener for free. You may think that if villain is over three betting pre-flop, that the correct adjustment would be to start four betting more in position. And I would say don't do that. Because what happens pre-flop specifically when you start four betting is you're passing up an opportunity to realize your positional advantage. You're kind of nullifying your post-flop positional advantage by reopening the action. So just overcall and then take the data points as they come post-flop. Because like, that's just a thing, right? Like you have to take the data points as they come and then construct strong, resilient strategies based on the information you're provided with. So don't just open up the action with a four bet when you're in position and then neutralize your own positional advantage by doing so.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Just calling allows you three more streets right now where you're on the button. They're out of position against you and you have so many more options right there. That makes a lot of sense. Love that point there.
Yeah, it's just something I see people messing up all the time. It's like, well, I've got king queen suited here. I'm just going to four bet it. And it's like, why are you giving up your positional advantage when like that is so valuable post flop? You're just, and then they jam and they just fold. And it's like,
and
wow,
you just, yep.
We could have just realized our positional advantage and taken data points to figure out if villains are over aggressing so that we can, over float and over defend, or under aggressing so that we can bet versus miss C bets and realize fold equity that way. Like we just have so many future options and potential. To throw them away like that is almost just a tragedy to me.
Yeah, it is a tragedy doing that right there. Absolutely. I love that. I love that play.
In a world where a fish donk bets the flop and you don't know what to do, one man,
Coach Brad Wilson,
has a surefire plan to neutralize flop leads and rip that dunk to shreds. Nuffle. Available now. Go to chasingpokergreatness.com/nuffle. Rated R.
Okay, so yeah, we're 53 minutes in. We haven't really talked about any of the things that I had prepared for us to talk about.
Hey, that's okay. I think we covered some good ground.
We can
keep going. Totally. I've got all the time in the world.
Yeah, we've covered some great ground, and it's been great just discussing more pure poker strategy, right? Than like the typical CPG episode that is not Tactical Tuesday, of diving deep into the, my guest's journey about what led them to poker and all of their success and all of that stuff. I do, in my heart of hearts, I'm a poker player first and foremost, and I'm a professional, and this is how I've made my living for a very long time. And quite honestly, I could crank out these kind of strategic episodes at least once a day, probably 2 or 3 times a day, just because it's like, it's like breathing to me.
Mm-hmm. All you got to do is imagine your student asking you one question. My opponent donk bet one big blind on this flop. What should I do? I mean, given the fact that you created Nuffle, I mean, you can go on for 30 episodes at 10 minutes each easily on on analyzing and what you should do in that spot.
Well, unfortunately with Nuffle, since it's only one PDF, I'm afraid of giving anything away because it's so simple. Like basically, I think in 15 minutes, I could give all of Nuffle away if I so chose, just because it's so simple. But yeah, Feeding Frenzy, where I mapped out every single turn and river situation, value bet thresholds, call down thresholds, facing various raise sizes, and then various follow-up bets on every single turn and river combination possible with every single hand that you could possibly have. Now that one is something that I could talk about for quite a while because it is very, very in depth. And you mentioned it's kind of humorous thinking back on it, but like when I created Feeding Frenzy and I had done all the data analysis and I had my spreadsheets, there were, it looked insane to somebody that was like, what are you working on? And then I would like show a private coaching student who had already, pre-bought Feeding Frenzy. And I'm like, here, this is, Feeding Frenzy before it's broken down visually. And it's just hundreds and hundreds of grids and hundreds of calculations, just tons of spreadsheets that like had to be distilled down into something that's like learnable and executable. So like there's always challenges, I think, that the customer never gets to see in the production process.
Yeah.
Just because you pare things down and try to present it easily. But like that thing was just, just imagine every single turn and river combination possible. And then imagine facing various bet sizes, various lines. It was a
mountains of data right there for you to go through.
Absolutely. It was a chore, and I could probably talk about the strategies there for a few weeks, but by and large, even that I distilled down to created something called Holy Heuristics, Whispers from the Poker Gods, as like a bonus for Feeding Frenzy, and basically heuristics that I had found that teach you most everything very, very quickly, so that like you can understand the broad strokes very quickly. And I think that's the thing I'm probably going to continue making for my products moving forward, just because like those kind of heuristics are very, very helpful, help you logically navigate those kind of spots without, having 100% of the information memorized through just rote memorization.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Rote memorization, not necessarily how you want to play poker, because you're up against so many different players and it's so much information anyway to try to memorize, right? You gotta kind of understand, like a lot of the stuff that I coach and teach, I try to show them how they should analyze and look at the situation, all the different data points in this one hand right now. Not only you take your past experience into account, you've seen players make this type of bet 1 billion times. What does it normally mean, right? But then also noticing everything else in this one hand right now and trying to figure out a way to like holistically put a big picture together of what's going on and then making your best plays. Because like really, it's so hard. I've tried it before in poker. I can't really memorize certain plays on this certain board type all this time as the preflop raise, as a preflop caller when this comes out. I just can't remember all that stuff, So I've had to devise ways to basically pay attention to the action, analyze the situation, and consider your options and choose the one that's most positive EV.
Yeah, and I think there's a misnomer, and one of the higher level players in Greatness Village said something that really resonated with me, and just a brilliant poker player, poker coach. He said that he doesn't think poker players, professional poker players, do a significantly better job of capturing data points than weaker players. The thing that he believes they do way more efficiently and are way superior at is prioritizing the data points and choosing the one that is most important to base your decision on. Like that's the thing that the best poker players do very well. They understand, they see the data points, and then they're able to prioritize them in a way that leads them to the correct conclusion more often than not. And that's tricky because a lot of times you have conflicting data points and you have conflicting information, and you must choose something to base your decision on, right? You can't just time out every time you're in a spot where fish under bluff rivers, but now I'm getting raised here or raised like minimum on the river, And I've seen this fish make value raises before, and they always shove, and like I've never faced a minimum raise. So like, what does this mean? And so you have these conflicting points of like, well, this player chooses large sizings with their value, and yet fish by and large under bluff by raising the river. So which one do you prioritize, right? Do you call lighter? Do you overfold? And it's stuff like that where like the better poker players are just able to make better decisions as it relates to priority. And ultimately, like that's just a key piece of playing poker at a high level is understanding what's important and what's not important, right? And you know, a lot of times somebody will tell me like, "Oh, I have the range advantage, I have the nut advantage, so I'm just going to bet." And I'm like, "Well, is that really the data point that ought to take priority here? Like, do you just always bet this board because at 90% because you have the nut and range advantage? Like that doesn't make much sense to me. You know, sometimes we should be checking, sometimes we should be using a smaller size." So anyway, just for the listener, make it a point to notice the data points, track them, and then also practice prioritizing them. And that will go a long way towards, you know, just improving on a systematic, regular basis.
That sounds like that could be your next course. Creating a systematic way to track the data points, tons of different hand examples, point out 5 different things. The quiz is, what do you think is the most important data point? Bam, there's the answer. And then you continue on with your example, then go on to the next example. I think you got a good course there, Brad.
Oh man. So first of all, I don't think I could make the course just because I would feel bad. Just kind of like taking somebody else's concept and building on it and selling something. I think there's a little bit.
You can cut that part out of the podcast if you want. You could use it.
No, I would make him build the course and then we would split the money. I think that's the way that I would go about it.
There you go.
but ultimately, that is a monstrous project. I don't even know. You kind of got my gears turning, and I don't even know how you would go about doing such a thing. Like it almost feels like an art of prioritizing the right data points very regularly. And I don't know how to, man, that's a thing that like, it seems very, very, very difficult to systemize a process that leads you to the right answer more often than not.
Yeah, it does. And for any example so I'm thinking about the idea for the course as well. Any example that you give, like you would go through your database and find the perfect hand or create the perfect hand that illustrates the point you want to make. But, you know, your students, they could go through their database and find 17 hands that contradicts the data point, you know, the exact same situation, but the end result was completely different. So, but it seems like it would be the whole course would be geared towards forcing you to think about the data available and then choosing the one that makes the most sense to base your decision on, or the one or two things, right? And yeah, you're right. It does seem like it's more of an art. And so me being a sciencey, mathy guy, I don't think it's the kind of course that I could make. Maybe someday, but
I mean, effectively, you would have to start. We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, I think, because I think the place to start would just be on noticing the data points and getting into the habit of noticing the relevant data points. But the reality is, like, there are just an infinite number of data points that come into play, right? And especially if like somebody plays live poker, right? I think one data point that I use as an example of just the infinite number of data points that are available is like Teddy KGB. Who would have thought that an Oreo would be a data point on which you ought to make a poker decision on, right? So like there are just so many different data points. Like the more observant players will pick up on stuff like the Oreo tells or timing tells and sizing tells. And that's just another thing that I think comes from being an advanced player. And then too, like when we're talking data points, you know, we can take a line holistically, right? And we can say this is overbluffed, this is underbluffed. But not everybody's going to have access to the same information that you have access to as it relates to those lines and those sizings. So yeah, it's like I'm imagining constructing it, and it just feels like it would be a massive, massive and difficult undertaking.
Yeah, it seems like, but so it's like earlier I mentioned at the very beginning, ideas are a dime a dozen, and this could just be one of those dime a dozen ideas.
I think the reality is with a lot of my courses, like with Nuffle, for instance, right? I just give call thresholds. Like I just tell you, if you have a hand stronger than this and your opponent bets this much, then call with this hand and you will make money, right? Like that's pretty cut and dry. And I think that like through that sort of systemization, the data points are very obvious and the priority of the data point is very obvious. Fish, donk, bets. Okay. That's a priority. Now we move into Nuffle protocol. Now we look at the sizing they use on the turn, and that's going to dictate what our turn strategy is with the specific hand category that we have. And so I think that like through the systemization like that of strategies, we kind of organically solve the prioritization issue because they just know what to prioritize because like,
that's right.
That's the answer, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is the answer right there. Yep.
All right, man. So tell the Chasing Poker Greatness listener, tell them something you're working on. You mentioned the Poker Forge, something you're proud of putting out in the world and why they ought to invest their money into the Poker Forge.
I absolutely love the Poker Forge. It's what I didn't realize it at the time when I started Smart Poker Study. It's what everything was building towards, right? Just the way I think of the Poker Forge, it's your roadmap on your poker journey. I start you off with your very first steps and with the Quick Wins poker course. And I tell you, so I'm assuming that when you come to me, you're not like the very first day player, right? You're potentially a losing or a break-even player for a long time and you want to get profitable. So Quick Wins Poker Course gives you all the simplest things that you can do starting right now with your very next session, whether it's playing or study session, what you could do to start progressing on your journey the right way, start making money. And then I go into hand reading and then the Preflop hand selection course and all the kind of stuff. But right now I'm really focused on my HUD mastery course. It's the 9th course within the Poker Forge. And this is the one. So for all those people, we had mentioned it earlier, people that think you can't get a read before 200, before 100 hands or something. This HUD mastery course is going to teach you how to learn your HUD, where all the HUD stats are, what the HUD stats tell you, understand the math behind them, and then how to start using them to understand what your opponents are up to. Now, that doesn't mean it's a HUD reliant. I'm not teaching you to be reliant on your HUD, I guess I should say.
You're showing them which data prioritize, right? Like
exactly.
That's what you're doing.
Yeah. Your HUD is just another data point, one of 20 things that you can notice in any given hand, right? And then so I'm teaching you how to notice, how to understand what that specific HUD stat says in relation to the player's action right there. And so that's what I'm teaching. But I'm still in the hand examples I use and the discussions, the strategy discussions, we're still talking about this player just check raised you. Sure, he has a check raise stat potentially, but then what is his fold to c-bet stat? How does he generally approach the flop? What kind of flop is this? It's a 10-10-5 flop, kind of a hard to hit board. If he's c-betting, potentially he's bluffing, your own check raise against him could work, or whatever, vice versa. I said his check raise stat at first, but it's basically teaching you how to use your HUD as one more data point in helping improve your decisions.
Right. And this is a quick litmus test to the listener for how they think of data points and if they can do a better job of upgrading the way that they think about data points. If when you hear data point or somebody asks you, what are the data points of this situation? If your first response is, let me look at the HUD and see what the HUD says, you're doing a lot of things wrong because there are many, many, many data points in every single hand, like you mentioned, pre-flop position, the formation, the sizings, c-bet, how, the c-bet sizing, they can c-bet small, they can c-bet big. Are you in a position? Are you out of position? What's the flop texture? What's the expected c-bet percentage on this board? I mean, there are so many things beyond just the HUD that if you only, when you hear data points, if that's the first thing that pops into your mind, reflect and invest some energy into really understanding how line sizing and everything works. Because it's just, you're never going to be successful at poker if you don't understand those things.
100%. And let me tell you, the first data point for any hand I ever play is, who am I up against? What is this kind of player? Because that's going to dictate everything, right? What his pre-flop range is, trying to understand his sizings, what he thinks about his position. I mean, so much just starts with the player type. And that's why, like with the HUD, I'm in love with VPIP and PFR. because those two, even if you haven't been watching the player forever, you haven't seen that he's limped in, he's 3-bet 3 times, just see that VPIP and PFR. That gives you that initial indication of what kind of player he likely is. Now, all of your reads on the situation are helped a little bit by knowing that. Like, if you told me, Sky, I got 3-bet by this player in the big blind, and I said, oh, what kind of player was he? And you say, I don't know, it's the very first hand, he 3-bet the standard 9 big blinds. I would say, wow, that's kind of tough right there. You can't make any read on him. You could give him a 3-betting range at 9 big blinds from the big blind. You could develop that based on the average player that you see making 3-bets in that spot at your stakes. But it really does help to know if he's capable of bluffing, if he's only a value better right here. And so for me, data point number 1 is always player type.
And I would just say that, like, even if a player has played no hands, you can still understand through analyzing data points within data points.
Well, what if he bought in for 40 big blinds? That tells you something, as opposed to buying in for a full 100, you know?
What if somebody opens for 4x instead of 2.5? What if somebody 3-bets minimum instead of 3x? Like, what if somebody, you raise under the gun and somebody flats in middle position, which shouldn't be a thing. When you, that's another part of, the value of understanding a strong pre-flop strategy is that whenever somebody does something that's not supposed to be a thing, it jumps right off the page. You're able to recognize it instantly and then profile that player as most likely a fish, which is very valuable because the quicker you profile them, the quicker you get to deploy, your fish destroying strategies and the more money that you ultimately make. So, like, really, you just, everything kind of starts with pre-flop. And then, like you said, understanding what good pre-flop play is supposed to look like allows you to identify the profile. Identifying the profile allows you to deploy your strategies. Deploying your strategies ultimately makes you money. So let's start doing the things that just make us money when we play poker.
Exactly. 100%. Yep.
Cool, man. So it's the URL to that is thepokerforge.com.
Yep. Thepokerforge.com. Nice and simple.
Awesome. And if you want to check that out, head to thepokerforge.com. Do we have a free month? Do we have any sort of sample? What do we got for new subscribers, Sky?
There are 3 full-length videos on the pokerforge.com page, full-length videos taken from different courses. So you could check those out. I periodically offer, like for this Mother's Day, which just passed recently, I offered the 10 days for $10 deal. Plus I was your poker mom for the 10 days. And then when I was your poker mom, you give me your stats and win rates off this tracker I give you, and I'll tell you where your most important areas of opportunity are and which videos, because you only have 10 days for that $10 in the Poker Forge, which videos are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck right there. And so that was me being your poker mom. So occasionally, once a month or so, I offer some different promos. But if you want to find out what promos are going on, you just got to be a member of smartpokerstudy.com, my mailing list.
Awesome, man. And yeah, the follow-up question there for the Chasing Poker Greatness listener outside of smartpokerstudy.com and the Poker Forge, where else can the Chasing Poker Greatness audience find you on the World Wide Web?
YouTube, Smart Poker Study, Twitter, Smart Poker Study. That's basically where everything begins right there. That's the easy way. And
any sort of podcast aggregator, just search Smart Poker Study and... Yep. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, it'll be there. And there's also, I have links on my website, smartpokerstudy.com. You just click that podcast button. There's different links to whatever your podcast platform is. Click it and you can find it right there. Awesome, man. It's been a pleasure having you on today. Thank you for your time and your energy. I very much enjoyed it. And guess what? Since we didn't ask a lot of the typical CPG questions, that just means you get to come back in the near future. And I think that's a win for... It's a win-win-win. Me, you, and the audience. 100%. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Brad. I had fun. Take care. All right, you too. Thanks for listening to Chasing Poker Greatness. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. Go to chasingpokergreatness.com to get the newsletter. Join the Greatness Village community. Book a coaching session or dive into the latest data-driven poker courses. Follow the show on Twitter @CPG Podcast.